Hi, I'm here to talk to you about my co-authored article, Sport, Drugs, and Amateurism, Tracing the Real Cultural Origins of Anti-Doping Rules in International Sport. Hopefully you'll have a good chance to discuss some of the issues like why do we use the word real in the title, and believe me, that was a hot debate between my co-author Matthew Llewellyn and I. But I want to give you some insights into the background and context for where the article came from and why we wrote it the way we did. The first things we looked at was the existing historiography on doping in sport, which had focused primarily on Knut and Mark Jensen's 1960 death at the Rome Olympics. That was an interesting point because we found quite a bit of primary source material that indicated anti-doping rules had existed before 1960. So what we did first was look at the Olympic charters and just see when did they put the rule on the book. What we found was not only was the rule on the book before 1960, though many authors directly said it wasn't, we found that it had been on the book since 1944, the first Olympic charter that had followed the World War II. This 1944 Olympic charter was the result of a 1938 Amateurism committee which had introduced the first anti-doping rule into the Olympics. The Amateurism committee had Siegfried Edstrom, Avery Brundage, Ritter von Holt, and Count Bonacasa, major players within the IOC during the 1930s and 40s. Brundage and Edstrom would both later go on to be president of the IOC. What was interesting about that was that 1938 we found letters and documents that show this was the first time that the IOC had looked at the doping issue. And that raised a real question in our minds. Why in 38 was this an issue? Looking at the letters and looking at some of the existing literature about the 36 games, which had preceded the 38 reforms, we realized that significant concerns existed about state-sponsored sport that had led to efforts to enhance athletes, both using physiology science as well as performance-enhancing substances. So we see that there's some sense that there's a larger context, but that wasn't very popular in the literature, and we couldn't find any specific cases that the IOC knew about that had made them concerned. It also wasn't clear why Violator, the president of the IOC at the time, had decided to make doping an issue. Where did Violator get the idea from? We know the IAAF had put an anti-doping rule onto its books in 1928, but it wasn't clear why Violator had been concerned about doping in 1938, a decade later. And that bothered us for a while, because usually things don't come out of nowhere. And so we began looking at Violator's background and realized that he connected two major periods of doping, the 36 concerns over state support for athletes, and a history working with horse racing, where doping had been a significant issue around the turn of the century. Violator owning horse tracks meant he was likely very familiar with doping from an area outside of human sport, and that is the whole history of doping in horse racing, which actually predated doping in the Olympic Games. So we think that a big reason this came into being at the time was in part because of the context around the 36 games, and in part because of Violator's background with horse racing. Having put those pieces in place, we found a lot of other really great evidence, like a handwritten letter from Avery Brundage where he had just scrawled out the first language that became the IOC's anti-doping rule as part of the Amateurism Committee. Now, I'll tell you, one question still bothers us that we weren't able to answer, and that is, why did the IAAF ban doping in 1928? So far, we don't know. There's no big doping scandal in 1927 or 26 that precedes that, and it's not clear why that became an issue. Hopefully one of you or somebody else out there will put that mystery to bed, but until now, it's a question that we still have. Thank you very much, and I hope you learned something and enjoyed the article.